We read that when Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them. But I wonder if somewhere between seeing the great crowd and having compassion for them, he copped a resentment. Because once again, he had been cheated out of some much needed rest. And if he did feel that way, I wonder if he resented himself for feeling resentful. And I wonder if the needs of the crowds, his own exhaustion, and the chances of never getting any rest chipped away at his weary spirit until what had begun as a few silent sniffles eventually broke into a full-fledged snot-slinging crying session. I wonder that because that's exactly where I found myself not so long ago. Standing in the kitchen, trying to chop vegetables for dinner, while at the same time unsuccessfully attempting to turn off the faucet of tears that seemed as if they might never stop. Sometimes it just gets to be too much. Sometimes the high-maintenance friend or family member, the annoying coworker, the insensitive supervisor, or the customer's attitude of privilege and entitlement just gets to be too much, and that's when you know it's time for a break. As our gospel text opens up, Jesus knows it's time for a break for both him and his disciples. Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while, he said to them. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. But it would seem that his compassion got in the way. Sometimes compassion gets in the way of self-care. The word compassion doesn't mean pity as we might use it in a conversation today. Compassion as it's used in our text means to suffer with. It means to see injustice and to stand in solidarity with those who are suffering. It even means doing what you can to reduce the suffering. When Jesus stepped out of the boat and saw the crowd looking like sheep without a shepherd, compassion stepped in, and any thoughts of rest and relaxation were put on the back burner. And unfortunately, the lectionary skips some information which I think is vital to a full understanding of the text. The first thing of which we are unaware is how Jesus' compassion was manifested. For reasons unknown to me, the lectionary dictates that we cover that next week. But just so you know, Jesus' compassion led to action. Not only did he meet the spiritual needs of the crowd of more than 5,000 people with his teachings, but he also met their physical needs by feeding them with the little bit of food that was at hand. I think that's worth noting. Compassion is a verb, not just a sentiment. The second thing that has been left out is that following the miraculous feeding of the crowd, Jesus picked up where he had been interrupted. He didn't forget his date with God. In verses not included in today's text, we read immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And it's after that overnight mountaintop retreat that the lectionary picks up once again with our text, telling us that Jesus continued to give himself over to compassion by healing the citizens of Gennesaret. Sometimes compassion for others steps in and takes precedence over ourselves. And these days there are plenty of opportunities for compassion to step in. There are more than enough justice issues from which to choose. All you have to do is pick a cause. If you are moved by the issues of hunger and poverty, then you will be confronted almost every day by someone asking for help with just a bite to eat. If the ongoing prevalence of systemic racism bothers you, then there are plenty of opportunities to challenge white family members, friends, co-workers, teachers, and even public officials to think critically about racism. If you fear that your rights as a lesbian, gay man, bisexual, transgender, or queer person are in danger of being taken away from you, then there are things you can do to make your voice heard. Interfaith dialogue, women's reproductive rights, sexual assault, unjust refugee and immigration policies, human trafficking, environmental degradation, gun violence. Pick a cause, any cause. There are more than enough to go around for everyone. It can be overwhelming if you allow it. So overwhelming that you may find yourself in the middle of the kitchen one day, crying your eyes out because there is so much brokenness in the world, and you're torn between the feelings of guilt if you turn away from that brokenness and feelings of resentment if you don't. In short, like Jesus in this morning's text, you will have compassion for others. You will find yourself suffering with them, because they are sheep. They are like sheep without a shepherd. And that's not such a bad thing, because I believe God suffers with them too, and that means you are in touch with God. But we cannot be so in touch with the divine that we lose touch with our humanness either. Like Jesus, we need to set aside some time with God, or we are in danger of burnout. Here are some things I notice about Jesus' self-care. First, he was persistent in seeking time out. As our text opens up, he has directed the disciples to join him in a deserted place. If we were only to read the text selected by the lectionary, it would feel as if we are receiving mixed messages. Take care of yourselves, he says to the disciples, but wait, here are some folks in need, so forget about your own. I think the church sometimes is guilty of those same mixed messages. It talks about self-care, but shames the congregant who does not embrace down in the trenches ministry. But as it turns out, Jesus wasn't giving his disciples mixed messages. He practiced what he preached. As soon as he had addressed the needs of the crowds, he scurried off for some quiet time with God. We need to be just as persistent as was Jesus, even if it means scheduling a block of time into our day for that quiet time. The second thing I notice is that the quiet time was spent in prayer. I don't think Jesus sought to get away from the crowds so much as he was seeking to reconnect with God. The frenetic pace of our world and the urgency of those who compete for our attention can become distractions from the remembrance of who and whose we are. Left to our own devices, we can imagine that it's up to us and us alone to rescue other people. But when we set a time aside to reconnect with God, we are able to center ourselves and refocus on the one who calls us by name. And the third thing I notice is that his quiet time with God was rarely more than a day or so. And that's probably because he stayed connected with God in ways that you and I don't. I need to take a week off every so often because sometimes I don't tend to my spirit the way that I should. We need to remember that we aren't Jesus. We tend to allow the worries of the world to distract us much more than Jesus did. And by the time we realize what is happening, it very well might take a longer time to reconnect with God than an overnight retreat. Only you know how much time you need, so tend to your spirits. But please note that Jesus' quiet time was not spent sipping a Mai Tai at a seaside resort. Nor did he clutter up his friends' Facebook timelines with selfies and photos of his travels. That's called a vacation. A vacation is not the same as what took place on that mountaintop. There's nothing wrong with occasionally indulging ourselves with a vacation, but we indulge our spirits when we touch base with God in prayer. And remember that the reason you tend to your spirit is so you can return to the work of repairing a broken world, the way Jesus returned to the business of healing the sick and proclaiming the reign of God. There's a world of hurt out there, folks, and it can be overwhelming if we don't take care of our spirits. Jesus provides a good model for tending to our spirits in times like these. Take good care of yourselves so you can take good care of God's world. May we take the time to renew our spiritual connection with God the way Jesus did, so that God's will might be done on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.